Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your cybersecurity series. My name is Vlad, and today I bring to you some of our French cybersecurity folklore, and I take you back with me in 2017, right in the middle of our French presidential campaign. So we are at the second round of the election. There are only two contestants left. Of course, Emmanuel Macron from the center and Marine Le Pen from the far right. So as we are in 2025, we know that Emmanuel Macron won. But did you know that this election was a bit tampered with, and there was a cyber attack right at the last minute of the election campaign? So starting with, we are on the 5th of May 2017. We are on the Friday evening, and the election, the second round, happens on the Sunday. So on the Friday evening, there was a leak of data that was published on Pastebin by a user named Leaks, for of course Emmanuel Macron Leaks. And Pastebin is just a famous website that many researchers, whistleblowers, or even hackers use to publish information and release that to the public, a bit like WikiLeaks. And that was published a day and a half before the second round, so it's all very time sensitive. And also for contextual information, you need to understand that in France, we have this law that says basically the media are not allowed to comment on the election within the last 2 days because they could influence the last polls, even though at the time Emmanuel Macron was, according to the polls, way ahead, and they were estimating that he would get 62% of the voters approximately. But no one was meant, at least from a media perspective, no one was meant to comment on those events until the end of and the closure of the polls, the end of the campaign on the Sunday at 6. Nevertheless, of course, the campaigning crew they acknowledged the breach almost immediately, and they said they were victim of a massive and coordinated hack, and they were, of course, worried about the media, worrying about, in general, the public perception of the campaign. Because many people started using this breach, advocating that Emmanuel Macron was at the center of tax evasion, election fraud, whatever, many types of fraud. And of course, as the time situation was quite sensitive, it required a lot of investment from the analysts, the journalists, the investigators in general to understand what was part of those 9 gigabytes of data, which information could be accurate, which information could be proven in terms of authenticity. And that made, as you can imagine, a lot of fuss. Of course, looking back from today, this cybersecurity attack had almost no incident on the election in the sense that it happened at the very latest moment. The people already had made their mind, and we didn't see a lot of change in terms of results. However, it's still an interesting attack from a technical perspective again, because it allows us to illustrate the attack sequence and the techniques that the hackers are using. Here I'm using a source from Wikipedia.
Wikipedia? You're using Wikipedia as your source of information?
And yes, I know what we say about Wikipedia. However, they are to me a reliable source, and they are describing a bit how the attack unfolded. And you can see here those three segments. In red, we have what we call the adversary space. So here, according to some analysts, the attack came from Russian intelligence services, and particularly one organized group that we call Grizzly Steppe. Sometimes they go with another name. We call them Fancy Bear, and they are officially referenced under the tag APT28. So APT for Advanced Persistent Threat. We discussed that in one of the previous videos. This is equivalent to the organized crime organizations. And basically, we know that APT28 targets Western companies, Western governments. They were already identified as the source of the Hillary Clinton breach in 2016 in the US. So it's a known adversary, and it's widely studied by the analysts. So what did they do? Basically, the first step is to, of course, create some attacking infrastructure, create fake websites, and then launch an attack. If you remember the attack sequence that we discussed in Carbanac, but also in my previous videos, it's the 7 steps model. The first step is the reconnaissance, so the recon phase. They had properly identified stakeholders, contributors to Emmanuel Macron campaign, and they knew who exactly they were targeting. Step two, which is the weaponization, they crafted malicious documents, malicious websites in order to, again, target those populations more precisely. Step three of the attack sequence is the delivery. Here they chose emails with malicious links and they spammed that to all of the Emmanuel Macron campaigners, all the people who could be more or less navigating around him and having accesses, of course, to the servers of the Emmanuel Macron campaign. So they targeted here in blue, you can see we are in the victim space. They targeted those recipients. The guys, men and women, they clicked on the link. It's traditional phishing, nothing new here. Basically, they clicked on the link and they believed they were redirected to a legitimate website, but actually, this was a maliciously crafted website by the hackers. Everything looked the same, obviously, and all those credentials were collected and harvested by the attackers. Once they had sufficient credentials, they immediately reused them on the legitimate campaign servers, campaign interfaces. They reused those credentials. They used their accesses to deploy and install malicious payloads. So again, computer viruses. They navigated through Emmanuel Macron campaign servers and infrastructure until they found relevant documents. In this case, we are talking about email archives, written memos, notes, invoices. They collected all of that. They created an archive with it, and they extracted everything back to their own infrastructure. And you could think that the attack stops there, which is, I mean, quite straightforward. They manage to find credentials, they reuse those valid credentials, and they extract information. I mean, it looks simple enough. However, let's say the sauce, the extra sauce, or the extra crisp comes right after that. What they did is that they mixed legitimate documents with fraudulent forged documents. So they mixed all of that, and in the end, they released this entire pack to the public, knowing that it would take a lot of time to the researchers and the analysts to prove and to confirm the authenticity of some of the documents. Because when you receive mixed information, some of it is indeed legitimate. You have the right email addresses, you have references to events, and you can prove all of that. It's quite confusing to distinguish between the rightful legitimate elements and the fraudulent pack. And again, if you come back to my very first video about confidentiality, integrity, availability, so the CIA properties of cybersecurity, here we have a very nice example of how they did not only target the confidentiality. It's not about extracting data and publishing it to trying to damage the reputation of Emmanuel Macron. It's actually much more complex than that. It's about taking those data and attacking the integrity, mixing it with fraudulent data, and then releasing it. So I think from a, let's say, lessons perspective, it's quite interesting as an example, and I hope you enjoy it too. But then maybe you have the question on how can we confirm, how do we know whether or not this was indeed the Russian intelligence services? And this is the second part of today's video. The idea is to show you that this is not always easy and there is not always a consensus from the different analysts and intelligence services on who is to blame when there is a cyber attack. So first off, we have Tom Hoffman from Flashpoint, which is also one of the security companies. They do a lot of threat intelligence and threat assessments. Basically, they performed, of course, an assessment on Ep.28, and according to them, this interference that we saw in the French elections is comparable to other campaigns led by Fancy Bear. So we talked about the US and Hillary Clinton, but there were also other attacks. And for them, as they say, this recent leak of Macron documents fits into a pattern of cybersecurity activity directed against Western government entities. So for them, it's consistent with the modus operandi of Fancy Bear because they know that Fancy Bear, which is kind of backed by the Russian government, always, or let's say most of the time, attacks Western companies or Western government entities. But it gets a bit trickier when you look at the rest of the interview. So this was an interview given to Cyberscoop, and even though they quoted analysis from Trend Micro, they quoted certain facts, etc., they still acknowledge that when you look at the data points, meaning that's a fancy way of saying when you look at the facts individually, um, they don't actually have anything to do with APT 28 or Russia. But they said, well, when you look at all of those elements, all of those traces, when you look at the bigger picture, we believe with a moderate confidence that it was indeed APT 28. And I think this is quite striking because we are drawing conclusions from not individual facts or individual evidence, but we are rather commenting on a pattern. Um, and in the end, we end up blaming a group of hackers and, by extension, a country, even though there is no formal evidence. And as you can see on the previous slide, when I showed you the graph of attack, it was written Grizzly Step and it was already attributed, and this information was relayed. And when you think about it, this also has consequences on the diplomacy. So the cyber attack is one thing, the media consequence is another, but then you have also the diplomatic incidents that it generates because you have basically media that are accusing a global power as Russia. And I told you there is no consensus because, of course, this incident was widely analyzed. As you can imagine, it's the election campaign of one of the G8 countries. So, of course, there was a lot of media attention. And also, the French intelligence services, they did their own analysis. And here you have Guillaume Poupard, who at the time in 2017 was the head of the French government cybersecurity agency. Basically, so it's called the ANSSI in French, ANSSI. And basically, when he gave his conclusions to the press, he said that this hack was, and I quote, so generic and simple that it could have practically been done by anyone. And he also stated that they found no trace that the Russian hacking group, as APT 28, or Russia in general, was to be responsible for this attack. And in fact, for them, it was so simple that basically it could even be carried by a single individual. So from the very beginning of this video, we are talking about organized crime and a group of hackers and complexity. But actually, when you look at the different steps, I mean, creating a fake website, sending a few emails here and there, using the credentials that you get from morons who fell into your trap, I mean, it's not that extensive. Yes, you need a bit of IT knowledge, and of course, there is some skills required. However, when you look at it, and when you look at the information that was extracted from an email archive, in the end, according to the French intelligence services, it doesn't take a huge effort and a huge group to conduct this attack. So here we are in between two versions. Some point directly at Russia, some are more cautious and say, well, could have been anyone. That's for you to judge, but I just want to highlight in this video that uh, attributing cyber attacks is a very complex domain, and even within the cybersecurity community, it's hard to find consensus. Sometimes they try to protect themselves and say we have a moderate level of confidence, whatever that means. But yeah, just to show you that it's not always easy to attribute attacks. And when you see the media who are not reading carefully the statements, not reading carefully the analysis, then they go out and say, well, it was Russia, and they create a lot of fuss about it. The facts and the actual elements are much more harder to prove. But again, that was just to give you another perception of one of the famous cyber attacks in Europe, specifically in France. And I will be back further with other videos. Thank you for your time, and I hope you liked it. Stay tuned.